Hi students, so this is Mrs. T for our short week, week 3 of cultural geography class. We're moving into chapter 2 today, and when I was developing my lesson plans over the weekend, that's one of the things I did do work-wise over the holiday weekend. I have not graded all of the reaction papers yet from this class for week 2 that you submitted last Saturday, but that will be done before this next reaction paper is due so that you've got my feedback on that and can kind of get your bearings. We're still early in the semester, so I know that sometimes reaction papers are not entirely clear what you should be doing yet. People are a little bit iffy when I ask you to pick your own topic. Sometimes students are not comfortable doing that, especially right at the beginning of the semester. But anyway, so you'll have that feedback from me as you see the reaction paper grade appear under my grades. You should be able to click on, I think there'll be like a little icon, maybe like a little dialogue bubble looking thing that you click on so you can see what my comments were. I'm having a little bit of trouble with my computer, so if you see a dialogue bubble and it's empty, will you text me and let me know, because I'm having a little trouble with my computer, so we'll see how that goes when you're getting that feedback from me. So this is week 3. It's a short week because of Labor Day. Project 1 is underway, so I need your text messages about your questions having to do with Project 1. We can have a phone call about Project 1 if you would like. However, when we hang up from that phone call, if we make any decisions, like if I approve a different movie or a different news story or something else for your for you to complete Project 1, you're going to have to text me what our decision was, because I have 102 of you and 1 of me, so I need to make sure that I remember when I have given somebody permission to change up or tweak a project or something if you want to get approval to do a different movie or a different book or a different video game or something like that to complete Project 1 successfully. If when you're hearing this you're like, what? Project 1? Video game? Movie? What? Then shame on you. You need to log into our course content right now and access that Project 1 folder, because I've got a video of me explaining what to do, and the folder, the file itself with all the instructions on it, an assignment submit box, and some extra videos that you can watch to kind of help you with some pointers on completing Project 1 successfully. So anyway, make sure that I hear from you on that, because Friday is Cyber Friday as usual, whether you are normally a face-to-face student or all virtual. Friday is really work day for that. So, and today too, anytime. It's due for y'all, I think it's due Sunday night at 6 p.m. Check in Blackboard because the due date is listed there. Okay, so today we are transitioning into Chapter 2. I believe the last time we were together we talked about maps and the usefulness of maps, but also the biases that can be apparent in maps. So today we're going to talk about one of the key things that geographers use maps for, and that is population. It's demographics in general. I think the first term that you will read about in Chapter 2 is a word called demography or demographics. Let me use that word demographics here. Okay, so anytime you see graph on the end of a word, we're talking about literally drawing, if we go back to the Greek meaning of this root word here, literally drawing the population. So demo here, you might know, or you might recognize that as the beginning of a democracy. That means ruled by the population, right? Democracy. So demo is the population here. We're drawing literally the population characteristics. That's a literal translation of that. I love etymologies, and so I tell you things like this that can win Jeopardy for you. But technically, the definition of demographics is studying the ways that population is distributed across the environment, across the city, across a rural area, across the world. Demographics, what's the composition? Let's understand the composition of population in a place or in the world. So that's what demographers do. They want to know different social characteristics of the populations that exist across the planet. So in this population chapter that we are going to branch into really deeper cultural geography content, this is still going to build some foundational information that we need to understand the way why a geographer thinks the way a geographer thinks in comparison to other questions that other social scientists ask. Geography, really, and demographics specifically, is extremely useful to study for policymakers in government, for urban planning, for global planning, if you're going into business, for marketing, if you're going into the culinary fields, for being able to access the foods that you need for your menus, this kind of thing. Demographics and the way the cultural makeup of the population, I'm getting a little ahead of myself with this, we'll ease into all this knowledge, is really, really important for understanding the people in your general area, what their wants, needs, attitudes, and desires are. So demographics is a really important field of study that doesn't sound fun and interesting maybe from the very onset, but it's really, really useful with whatever career you're going to go into. And in particular, policymakers, government officials really need an understanding of this. They always have geographers on their staffs so that they can get information about the population that they serve. Okay, so demographics is a key, it's a key concept that we're going to talk about when we discuss religions and sex and gender and health and safety and all of those kinds of topics that we are going to cover for the rest of the semester. So, specifically, in Chapter 2, we're going to look at population, okay? So, population we can look at in a number of different ways, and we will. The distribution of the population is different from one place to the next. The political ideology is different from one population in this region compared to another region. So there's all kinds of different ways we can look at population, but we're going to start at the beginning, and we're going to look at population density specifically, okay? So population density is our first basic concept for Chapter 2 that we need to look at. And actually, population density is really, the definition of it comes out to a very simple division math problem. It's a very simple math problem. It is the number of people, it's the number of people in a population, the whole population. I'm going to abbreviate the word population with POP here. So it's the number of people in a population divided by, or if you're writing this out in a sentence, the number of people in a population per unit of land, okay? So in the case of the entire population density, the unit of land is the entire area of the country or the region that we're talking about. So the entire area of the United States would be on the very bottom of this equation where you divide the number of people in the population per unit of land. And so, for instance, let's ask Siri what the population of the United States is. What is the population of the United States?
In 2019, the population of the United States of America was 328,213,523.
Okay, so we're going to just say, thank you, Siri. We're just going to say 328 million people. That's a number as of 2019. Okay, that's why we need to ask Siri pretty regularly what the population of a place is, because even though in the United States, every 10 years, there is a constitutional effort called the census, and every 10 years, that census collects basic demographic information about the population. And this year, 2020, is a census year. So there was a lot of debate about the census too, because it was trying to decide whether we're just supposed to collect information about citizens or collect information about people who are residents but non-citizens and that kind of thing. The census collects population information, and again, it's part of the constitutional duties that the federal government is supposed to perform, because based on the number of people in the population and other demographic features like their age group, their religious philosophy, their sex and gender orientations, those kinds of questions give us a good idea of the types of people in the population and also what the population density is of a place. So this is a 2019 number. When the 2020 census is fully counted and collected first, because we're not finished collecting census information, but collected and counted, this number will change. So here's the number of people in the population in the United States, and typically what we use as far as the unit of land, typically we use square kilometers. I know in the United States, miles are more our thing. They're more in our mental maps that we have in our minds. We think of miles, but kilometers are typically the unit of land that we use to measure in geography. So let's ask Siri how many square kilometers the United States has. How many square kilometers is the United States area?
United States of America has an area of 3,794,100 square miles.
Oh, she gave it to me in miles. She wouldn't even give it to me in kilometers. So I'll go ahead and do the miles, and you can also ask Siri to convert that to kilometers for you if you would like. But basically, let's say it is 3.8 million miles, square miles it says. So 3,794,000 square miles, so 3.8 million essentially. Okay, so these numbers are off by about 10. So this is going to be 328. They're off by about 100, sorry. So anyway, people in the population by area of land in the country, here's your basic math problem, and you come out with the population density. This is everybody, including elderly people and tiny, tiny babies, people who don't work, in other words, is what I'm saying, with the area of land. And you can figure this out for any country, anywhere, the population density, based on, as it changes, as we collect more and more information about the population makeup in that area. Okay. So that's just general population density. The United States has a general population density of about, well, I know this off the top of my head based on, this was miles, remember, so if you divide this out, or square miles is what this was. If you divide this out, it's going to give you a different number than this, but it's about 8 or 10 people per square kilometer in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me on that. Look that up and text me with a correction if I'm misremembering that number. So anyway, that's about the population density of the United States. So in other words, we have a whole lot of land. There's not very many people per square unit of land in the United States. We've got some population clusters, mainly in the northeastern and southeastern parts of the United States, definitely the New England kind of area of North America and that general area of Canada, right above what we call New England. That's a really high population cluster for North America. And then southeast United States, say from Mississippi toward the Atlantic coast and those Gulf states down there, that has a whole lot of population. And then the East Coast in general and the West Coast in general has a whole lot of population. The Sun Belt, like the bread box of the United States, where we grow a lot of food and where there's a lot of farmland, there's not a whole bunch of people in that particular area. So you've got fewer than one person per square kilometer in many regions of the central part of the United States. And that's why it evens out. You've got an area like New York City or Los Angeles, California, or San Francisco with really high population densities for that city, but it spreads out and because of all the land that we have available. Like in Alaska, for instance, most of the land in Alaska is not habitable, at least not in the way you or I know how to survive there. And therefore, you've got that huge amount of land added into this number down here, divided into this population of people, and it brings our population density down. So this is a general number, a good number to be able to reference, so you know what this tells you is how much land is available per person there. It's going to give you a number that tells you whether it's a congested place or not. Is it congested, or is there a lot of room to move around? And that's what general population density gives us. However, there's another type of density that we're going to look at, and that has to do, in order to look at this new type of population density that we're going to talk about today, we have to get a new vocabulary word. General population density looked at all of the land that was available, but this more specific type of population density uses this concept, arable land. Arable land refers to land that can be farmed. You can use arable land in agricultural pursuits. So in other words, food production, a food getting strategy, arable land is key to feeding all of those people in the population. So if, for instance, I mentioned Alaska a minute ago, the population density of just Alaska is a very, very, very low number because you have a huge amount of land, but that land doesn't support a whole lot of people to live there, so you got a low population, a huge amount of land, small number on the top, huge number on the bottom, you're going to divide that and get a tiny number. And so you've got, in Alaska, there is not a lot of arable land at all, and the time of year, the growing season that you do have for the land that is arable, is very, very short. So arable land, land that can be farmed, that should have an ED on the end, land that can be farmed is an essential part of this next type of population density. This is physiological density. Physiological density is the number of people in a population. So the thing on the top stays the same. The number of people in a population over the amount of arable land. The amount of arable land. So when you have the number of people in a population over the amount of arable land, this is going to cut your overall general land considerably in some cases. For instance, if you look at Egypt as an example, that's a pretty big country in general. It's got a lot of land, so the population density is not, in the general population density is not so very high, but if you compare it to the amount of land that can be farmed to the population, it shoots up. You've got a really, really high physiological density, which means there's a whole lot of people that rely on that little tiny bit of land for food. A whole lot of people rely on that food if you were limited within the borders of your country for the food that is consumed by the population there. So there are some assumptions we're making here about the ability for a country to sustain itself basically without imports to help supplement the food that's available to those people. So that is your physiological density. And this tells us really the amount of self-sufficiency that a country could have in terms of being able to feed its own population. Or be independent of others in order to feed the number of people who live there. This is physiological density. It tells us a lot, and you can use this information in policy making and definitely in globalized trade negotiations. You have to consider this seriously. Another type of density that we're going to talk about, which changes, it doesn't change this. It's key to note that Arable land does not mean it is being farmed, it just means it's possible to be farmed. In some cases, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what the next kind of density is that we're going to talk about. It is agricultural density. And that leaves the arable land on the bottom here. So we still have the amount of arable land on the bottom. But now, instead of just wanting to know in general the number of people that arable land has to support, now we want to know the number of farmers or the number of people who are working that arable land. What? Why? Why would we want to know this? There's that why question, right? The why question that we always ask in geography. Why on earth would we want to just focus on the number of farmers that are working that arable land? Well, if the number of farmers is really high compared to the arable land, that means there's a lot of manual labor that has to go on. So in other words, agriculture is happening, food production is happening to support the population, but a larger number of the people in the population have to be in agricultural labor positions in order for that arable land to be in production, for it to yield food for the population to eat. So this number tells us a lot of stuff about the level of development, and we will get into levels of development of countries throughout the world. When we compare countries throughout the world, this number is a really significant number in talking about if a country is developed, developed, or developing, or underdeveloped. This number gives us a lot of information about that. If you have a lot of farmers working the units of arable land that are available, that tells you automatically there is not a lot of industrialized agriculture going on. We are going to talk we're going to talk a large amount of time talking about agricultural revolutions, plural, that have happened over human history, industrial revolutions, plural, that have happened over human history. Agriculture has been a part of human history for thousands of years. 6,000 years or more minimum, we see in the archaeological record that agriculture was happening instead of other subsistence strategies that we will also look at during this class. The word that I just used was subsistence. A subsistence strategy is the phrase that I just used. A strategy is a plan, and subsistence means to survive. Well, food, clean water, and shelter are the basic necessities for human beings to survive. So agriculture is a subsistence method that enables a population of people to thrive because there's surplus food that's produced, typically. Agriculture typically produces, not just typically, agriculture always, the focus is surplus of food. Farmers produce more than what they themselves and their immediate social group, like their family or their village, needs. So agriculture's focus is on surplus. Before industrialization, which brought about machinery to help with agriculture, and think about what you know about the Industrial Revolution from your history class, the focus was on manufacturing and machine making. And the machines that they made, the first machines that they made, were agricultural related, because the goal was to reduce the amount of work it took, handwork, elbow grease, that you and I, as people working the land, had to put in. The machines focused on making the farmer's work easier. And so if this number here on top, the number of farmers working the arable land, if it's low, that tells a geographer immediately that the land, the country that we're talking about, is developed because they have a high degree of industrialization. You might have a really high amount of arable land. The United States has a huge amount of land that can be farmed. We've got a great situation as far as climate and arable land go. We don't need a whole bunch of our population to focus on farming though, because we have a high degree of industrialization, and I don't even know what all the machines are called, but there's combines and reapers and combines and reapers and cotton pickers and all kinds of different things that harvest the stuff, and then all kinds of different mills that process it, automated process it. We don't need people to do it by hand anymore because the Industrial Revolution, which was primarily focused in the Western world, we'll talk about Europe as one of the population clusters in the world, because industrialization, that's really the bed of industrialization was Europe. Those developed worlds, developed countries in the world tend to have a really low number of farmers per arable land. If you have a high number of farmers per arable land, it tells you that either the country is underdeveloped or in the process of developing. So that gives us a lot of information about the need for investment, the need for urbanization and industrialization in a place, the need for, or it's also a marker in a lot of cases about human rights and gender inequality. If you see a lot of people working in an agricultural sense before industrialized machinery was available to them, you see quite a bit of difference in gender roles, in education levels for a population, definitely in the economic structure of the nation as a whole, and the economic structure of households in general. Those are the core economic units of a society. You can glean from agricultural density and from physiological density a whole lot of information about the general health and well-being of a population. The more people in a population who have to focus on agricultural production, the fewer that people are available to focus on research and development and health, the health industry, or work in medical care, disease cure kind of roles. Demographics and population densities, these different types of densities, these are important markers for geographers to start with and understand. How we use maps to a certain extent is to show these different densities. In chapter 2, you'll see dot maps used, and they don't have the Mercator projection. They aren't the distorted maps that we looked at last week in class. You'll see the dot maps, which focus on population clusters, and they can demonstrate different types of densities also. And it gives a really good visual reference. This is a great class for people who don't want to just always have to read words, if they can look at a picture and interpret it based on a legend, for instance. So we'll be doing that a lot in this chapter on population. And in our next lecture that we talk about, I think it's our very next lecture, I'm going to show you what we also use to go along with maps, which are things called population pyramids. If you flip toward the end of chapter 2, you'll see several pages with population pyramids on them. We geographers, use population pyramids to examine the trends of what a population is going to look like over time. Is it growing? Is it staying the same? Is it shrinking? And so we literally have a graph called a pyramid where you've got males on one side and females on the other with bars that go up. I'll show you. I'll do a video where I have those on the screen behind me and I'm explaining this. But it sorts it by age, it sorts it by gender, and you can see if it's fat at the bottom, if it really is shaped like a pyramid, if it's fat at the bottom, you've got a really young population, a really high birth rate. And if it's tiny at the top, then you've got people who die regularly and don't really reach old age. If it's straight up and down, you've got a pretty even population. People are being born at about the same rate that they're dying in their old age. And if it's like this, if it's an inverted pyramid, with the point at the bottom and fat at the top, you've got fewer and fewer and fewer people being born, and the older group is older and older and older, living longer and longer, usually because of medical advances, usually because they have a lot of other industries other than agriculture available, so they can focus money and income and sectors of their economy outside the food production focus, and it's a benefit in many ways to a population in the society, whereas it can be a detriment in many ways too. So this will conclude this discussion of what demographics is and why we look at population densities in the way that we look at population densities, the kinds of information we can glean from that. And in the next time we talk, we will learn about Thomas Malthus and some population theories of the past. He linked food production to population growth, or population demise, if you want to look at it like that, and also those population pyramids, so we can understand how to interpret maps, how to use this information to allocate funds toward certain places where there's high population densities versus low population densities. That's one of the things the U.S. Census does, and other places that collect population information about people in their countries. That population information is typically used for policy making in the government, and it's very, very useful in looking to see where we need to allocate resources for the greater good. It's also used in politics in the case of the United States, how many delegates are you going to have in the Electoral College based on your population density in a place. And so the Electoral College is the way our government is set up so that each region has an allocated number of representatives to cast a vote for the presidential candidate, right? So you make sure that just because there's population density in one place that's really, really high, that, like, for instance, in California, you hear people talk about in California, there's a really high population, and therefore they should have more say in who the president is. I'm paraphrasing, right? But you'll see this argument. If you look at popular vote in California, probably you would say there's so many more people there, they should have a bigger voice. But there's a formula for the Electoral College that looks at that population density to make sure that, like, people in Nebraska, people in Iowa, people in Illinois, lower populated places, the Dakotas, that kind of thing, lower populated places aren't at the mercy, so to speak, or have as significant a voice or a chance to be heard as far as the presidential election goes. So you could, if you want to, especially since this is an election year, for this particular reaction paper, you could look up policies, government policies on farming. For instance, in the United States, we are highly industrialized. We have a really low number of farmers per arable land. And sometimes the government even, because of this information, because of census information, sometimes the government creates a farm bill where it actually subsidizes farmers, that means pays them a fee, pays them a livelihood, to not produce on their property, or to produce certain crops, maybe not even crops that are aimed toward the food supply. Maybe they're producing some sort of genetically modified corn in order to produce ethanol, for instance, for fuel sources. So anyway, there's all kinds of policies and issues that you can look up that have to do with using physiological density in policymaking, agricultural density in policymaking. And so there's a lot of different outside source opportunities that you have just by doing a little bit of basic searching for this information. Or as usual, you can just summarize this in paragraph form and submit me a reaction paper for week 3, which is due Saturday at noon. Okay, thank you for your time, and I will see you again in Geography Land. Bye.